They lived in the same cabin for 2 months and never once spoke about love. The rhythmic scrape of the metal shovel against the frozen earth was the only sound in the valley, a dry, repetitive rasp that seemed to underline the immense silence of the surrounding peaks. Elias worked with a slow, mechanical precision, clearing the heavy slush from the path that led from the cabin door to the well, his breath blooming in white, ragged plumes that vanished into the iron-gray sky. Beside him, muffled in a heavy wool coat that had seen better decades, Sarah was hacking at the ice in the water trough with a short-handled pick. They worked side by side, rarely looking at one another, their movements choreographed by weeks of identical mornings. There was no conversation, only the shared labor of keeping a small, flickering life going in a place that seemed determined to freeze it out. They had been living in the same four-walled space for 2 months, brought together by a blizzard that had claimed the livestock and a fever that had nearly claimed her, leaving them as two strangers bound by the practicalities of wood, water, and heat. Elias was a man who moved as if he were trying to leave no footprint on the world, his eyes always focused a few feet in front of his boots, carrying a heavy, silent history of failures that had driven him to the edge of the territories. Sarah was a woman of quiet, jagged edges, her grief having settled into a deep, echoing tiredness that made every movement feel like an act of defiance against the wind. The light was flat and thin, the kind of midwinter glare that revealed the grain of the wood and the fine dust trapped in the ice without providing any warmth. Elias finished the path and paused, his gloved hands resting on the shovel handle. He watched the way Sarah swung the pick, the rhythmic thud of the metal against the frozen surface vibrating through the soles of his boots. He stepped toward her, not to speak, but to take his turn at the trough. He didn't ask, he simply reached out, and she yielded the tool with a small, stiff nod. As their hands brushed, the cold leather of their gloves meeting, there was a brief, unremarkable friction. He began to break the ice into jagged shards, the splashing water freezing almost instantly on the rim of the cedar trough. Sarah stood by, her arms folded across her chest, watching the way the muscles in her shoulders shifted beneath the heavy denim of her jacket. She didn't think of him as a companion, nor as a romantic figure. He was simply the presence that meant the fire stayed lit and the door stayed barred. He was the sound of boots on the floorboards at midnight and the smell of cedar smoke in the morning. The wind began to pick up, a low, mournful whistle that scoured the dry grass at the edge of the clearing and threw fine grit against the cabin logs. Elias finished the ice and turned toward the house, gesturing with a tilt of his chin toward the door. They walked back together, their pace matched, the sound of their boots on the packed snow a synchronized crunch. Inside, the cabin was a dim, amber-toned sanctuary. The air smelled of dried sage, old coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of seasoned pine. Elias moved immediately to the hearth, kneeling to stir the embers of the morning fire. He added a handful of kindling, the small, dry twigs snapping like bone in the heat. Sarah moved to the kitchen area, her movements hushed as she began to slice a loaf of dense, dark bread. The room was small, but they had learned to navigate it without ever truly occupying the same space at the same time. It was a dance of avoidance that over the weeks had become a dance of comfort. He watched the way the firelight caught the fine, loose hairs at the nape of her neck as she leaned over the table. He noticed the way she favorited her left side, a lingering remnant of the fever that had left her lungs weak. He didn't offer words of sympathy. Instead, he made sure the woodbox was always full of the softest, easiest burning cedar, and he kept the kettle perpetually near the edge of the heat so she wouldn't have to wait for tea. Sarah, in turn, noticed the way Elias would go still whenever a hawk shrieked over the valley, his hand instinctively twitching toward a hip where a holster no longer hung. She didn't ask what he was looking for. She simply made sure there was always a warm plate of food waiting when he came in from the cold, and she kept his spare wool socks near the hearth so they would be dry and warm for the next day. They were healing each other in the margins through the steady, unobserved accumulation of small, necessary kindnesses. The afternoon was a slow crawl of shadows across the floorboards. Elias sat by the window, oiling a piece of harness leather, the repetitive motion of the rag against the grain providing a steady, hypnotic pulse to the room. Sarah sat in the rocking chair near the fire, her hands busy with a needle and a torn hem. The only sound was the hiss of the leather and the rhythmic click of the needle. The silence was not empty. It was a physical presence, a soft, heavy quilt that settled over them. Elias felt a profound sense of safety in the routine, a feeling that the world outside, with its violence and its unpayable debts, could not find him as long as he remained within the rhythm of this house. He looked at Sarah, the firelight casting a warm, flickering orange across her profile. She looked older than she was, the lines of worry around her eyes etched deep by the winter, but there was a softness there now that hadn't been there when he first found her. "The wind's turning," Elias remarked, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Sarah didn't look up from her sewing. "It'll be a hard freeze tonight. I'll bring in the extra cordwood before dark. I'll put the stew on early." That was the extent of their dialogue for the hour. It was enough. The words were merely markers for the actions that followed. Elias stood, his joints popping in the quiet, and pulled on his coat. He stepped out into the biting air, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. He worked with a feverish intensity, stacking the split logs against the side of the house, his mind clear of everything but the weight of the wood and the need to provide. Inside, Sarah moved with a similar focus, the sound of the knife against the vegetables a rhythmic counterpoint to the thud of the logs outside. They were two parts of a single, slow-moving machine geared for endurance. By the time the sun had vanished, leaving a sliver of electric purple along the ridge, the cabin was a pocket of gold in an ocean of black. They ate their meal at the small, scarred table, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp. The flames shivered in the drafts, casting long, dancing shadows of their forks against the walls. Elias watched the way Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup. He reached out, his hand hovering over the table, and for a moment the unspoken tension in the room thickened. He didn't touch her. He simply moved the lamp an inch closer to her side of the table, illuminating her work. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a heartbeat longer than usual. There was no spark of romance, only a deep, weary gratitude. "The lamp's getting low," she whispered. "I have another tin in the barn. I'll fetch it tomorrow." They finished in silence. The evening deepened, the cold pressing against the logs with a physical force that made the wood groan and snap. Elias sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He felt the tiredness in his bones, a heavy, dragging weight that made his eyelids droop. He watched Sarah as she folded the laundry, her movements slow and methodical. She moved to the hearth and sat on the floor, her back against the warm stones, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. Elias moved from the table and sat in the chair beside her. They were close now, their shoulders almost touching. The heat from the stones radiated through them, a dry, penetrating warmth that seemed to thaw the last of the day's chill from their marrow. The fire burned down to a deep, glowing bed of coals. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in until they were just two silhouettes against the dim red light.
Elias felt a sudden sharp pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sorrow, but a heavy, meaningful blend of both. It was the realization that he was no longer waiting for the next thing. He was already in it. He wasn't Silas, the drifter, nor Elias, the failure. He was simply a man in a warm room with a woman who didn't ask him to be anything else. He felt the tension leave his jaw, a knot he hadn't known was there, finally unraveling.
Sarah shifted, her head dipping toward her chest as sleep began to pull at her. She didn't move to go to her bed in the corner. She simply leaned toward the warmth of him, her shoulder coming to rest against his arm. Elias didn't move away. He stayed as solid as a mountain, his arm a warm, firm presence against her. He felt her breathing slow, moving from the shallow hitch of the day to the long, deep draws of heavy sleep. Her head eventually slumped onto his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and strange at the same time. He reached out with his far hand and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the back of the chair, draping it over her shoulders with a careful, silent tenderness. He didn't speak, and he didn't move to leave. He simply remained in the chair, his heart quiet, his mind clear, as the wind howled through the chimney and the frost continued to bloom in intricate silver patterns across the glass. He stayed exactly where he was, his shoulders supporting her weight, watching the last ember turn to gray ash in the hearth. Sarah stirred in her sleep, her hand moving blindly in the dark until her fingers brushed his wrist. She didn't wake, but she held on to him, her grip firm and certain. Elias leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing as the world outside vanished into the snow. He didn't need to say anything, and she didn't need to hear it. The way she held his wrist and the way he stayed was the only thing that mattered.